Hello, good evening, everyone. Grab a seat, welcome. Welcome at a media crisis on refugees. And welcome on behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger, European Cultural Foundation, Amsterdam City Rights, and Crisis Mag. My name is Meneer Samuel. I'm a journalist, a political scientist, and someone who really worked a lot actually on the issue of refugees. First in my foreign correspondency for the Groene Amsterdammer, The Correspondent, and some other Dutch newspapers. And later I wrote a lot on migrant issues in the Netherlands, also refugee issues, but more predominantly migrant issues here. And both will be topic of debate tonight in a Dutch and a European perspective. I'm really happy to see that on a Friday evening people come to such a serious debate, because I think this is really something that touches upon so many issues in our society and touches upon injustice and misinformation and de-information. So I'm really happy we can have a talk here, and I will try to make it as inclusive as possible, which means that first, ask questions, but please, on the moments that I give you the room to ask questions, so we can really hear each other out, because a lot is lost in translation, right? When we speak and interrupt each other over and over again. So let's try to really listen to each other. Also, I want to change the culture in Pakhuis a little bit, so I won't assume your gender. I will ask for your pronoun. So this is part of the Wij versus Zij, or the Us Against Them series, in which we look at the different communities in and outside this city. Amsterdam celebrates itself for being the most diverse city on earth with more than 180 nationalities, but in fact, of course, we don't really live and interact that much with each other as we might want to. It also deals with stereotypes and misrepresentations, and that's definitely a topic of debate tonight. We will first listen to two different keynotes or presentations. We have an international guest, which I'm very happy with, Ismail, and now suddenly I can't pronounce your name, which is so stupid. Inaction. I'm so sorry about that. I had it like, trying to remember it all day and then go wrong. And then we will have some videos which are part of his project that he will explain more about. And then we have a Q&A with some more local guests, but all with a very international orientation. So without further ado, the first international speaker is Ismail Enasheh. He's a journalist, an author, and a co-editor of the book, and I'll get it here, Lost in Media, which is also on sale tonight. You can buy it outside. Maybe you already saw the book table. It's about migrant perspectives on the public space. He actually has a very quite large resume. And for the sake of impression, I will just speak it all out. So he worked for The Guardian, The Sunday Times, NBC News, BBC News, do you all know it? The Nation, Foreign Policy, NPR. Let's see how literate this crowd is. He was a fellow for the Alice Patterson Foundation, an associate at the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement at University of Cambridge, an Ockberry Fellow at the you're so much, man. A Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University, and last but not least, he was one of the recipients of the EU Migration Media Award 2019. Ismail, the floor is yours.
Okay, that was hi, good evening. I think this is on. Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Meneer. I'm really sorry for having such an exhaustive biography, but it's typical.
Never
in the
apologize.
So, thank you to Max for this kind invitation, and thank you, Meneer, and to my fellow panelists. I'm so delighted to be here with you this evening in Amsterdam. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of this place, but it's fabulous. It's very difficult for non-Dutch speakers, so I won't pretend to do it. But thank you. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you about Lost in Media, which there's a presentation behind me, which you'll be able to see some of the slides from the book. Lost in Media, Migrant Perspectives and the Public Sphere. It's a book edited by me and Thomas Rouchet, my co-editor, who's over there, and this book is published by Valise in Amsterdam, who are selling the book outside, and it's published in cooperation with the European Cultural Foundation, And I'm really delighted that Catherine, the former director, is here with us this evening, and Vivian and Menno, also from the European Cultural Foundation, are here with us this evening. And I'd like to just briefly also acknowledge the passing of a colleague and a comrade and a friend of the ECF yesterday, Tony Serra, who set up the archive observatory of unidentified videos in Spain. He was an activist, a philosopher, a friend, passed too soon, and people like him really form the backbone of the kind of work around media activism and civic participation and diversifying the media that we've seen across Europe. So we remember our friend this sad evening and thinking about his family and friends. In this presentation, I will also discuss the problematic ways in which the media has covered migration in recent years, especially since the so-called migrant crisis. The book, which is here, gathers critical responses to the representations of migrants in the media in Europe through 9 essays by prominent writers, artists, and journalists. Ever since the so-called migrant crisis hit international headlines in 2015, I have, like many other journalists in Europe, spent most summers, in my case, in southern Italy, hearing the stories of young migrants who had survived the migration journey north, the human traffickers, torture, the Libyan civil war, and finally the dangerous sea crossings on dinghies across the Mediterranean into Italy. And reporting on stories of migration, I have seen since the crisis, partly caused by Europe's own border policies, how this has distorted media coverage of migration and framing on migrants, and in the process has made migrant perspectives be lost in the mainstream media. And since 2015, there has been a large increase in media coverage on this issue right across Europe. And the result has been, all too often, the coverage has been very negative. And not just in Europe, but across the world, the numbers of refugees has increased, reaching the highest number ever. And the reality, though, is that refugees actually make up a very small fraction of the world's population, and 90% of refugees stay in the areas of conflict, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Uganda, in Ethiopia. In Somalia, where I come from, and I came as a refugee at the age of 10 to the UK, most of the Somalis who fled because of the civil war in my native land are not in Europe. They are in Ethiopia, they're in camps in Kenya. And 80% of migration, for example, between African countries happens between African countries. It doesn't happen from south to north. We have had these myths which have gone unchallenged since the so-called refugee migrant crisis in 2015. And since 2015, we have seen how the EU has built a vast border infrastructure to keep migrants out, and it justifies letting migrants die in the Mediterranean as a deterrent to stop people smugglers, but this policy has failed. So far this year, 900 people have lost their lives crossing into Europe, and since the early 2000s, over 34,000 people have perished in the seas of Europe. The European Union, in my mind, has militarized the Mediterranean as its member states have squabbled over the legality of search and rescue missions and what they should do while people continue to die arriving to Europe. And to me, as I think it should be to all of us, it's astonishing that people continue to die in the seas of Europe. Europe, after all, is a continent of 500 million people, an economy of 19 trillion, and is one of the wealthiest and most developed regions in the world. And people continue to die. And this story, for now, since the peak in 2015 of media coverage, has rescinded in the media, and we don't really ever hear about it. And I think further, than just the coverage in terms of the media, we must also acknowledge that today's realities at Europe's borders are rooted in slavery, in colonialism, in mass extraction and global capitalism, which this city and this country are very famed for. A plethora of historic political forces that have imbued the West with power and wealth for centuries at the expense of countries in the global South. And when it actually comes to current public discussions about migration in the Mediterranean or beyond in Europe, this is a fact that is rarely acknowledged. Before I move on to talking about the contents of the book, I would like to briefly mention a few areas where I feel the media fails in their coverage of migration. For example, one of the areas that I think is really problematic is that journalists usually fail to tell the full story and routinely fall into propaganda. If you look at the coverage in print, in radio, online, there is a lack of context provided in the coverage that we read in our local or national newspapers. For example, where do people come from? How are they coming? How many are coming? Why are they coming? How does European foreign policy play a role in these movements, and so on and so forth? For example, the language is a real issue when it comes to the coverage I've seen. So, words matter. What is the difference between a migrant and a refugee or asylum seeker? Does it matter? Do people who read the newspaper know the differences? There's usually very sensationalist coverage that we see in the media. Often it's very emotive. There's a lot of emotion, no facts given. There's a lot of misrepresentation, and usually the reports that we see in the media are not culturally sensitive. And the language, again, is really problematic. So, for example, swarm, flood, these are metaphors, which usually are nature metaphors, which are very problematic. And another really big issue is that the representation of the migrant in the media is very problematic, usually between a good versus bad migrant. We have deserving and undeserving, and this can quickly become quite Dickensian, and we reduce people's individual or even collective stories that are very complex into these simple binaries. So for me, in my reporting on migration in Europe, whether it's interviewing migrants in Limbo in Amsterdam here, or trafficked Vietnamese children, or recently arrived African migrants in Sicily from places like Gambia and Senegal, for me it's not only about seeking to tell their stories or frame how the media depicts their lives, but it's also about looking at the system, the asylum and migration system, and how that actually works. What happens at borders with police during the immigration process? Is it fair? Is it transparent? Is it humane? Does it adhere to fundamental human rights, many which are enshrined in EU and national laws? We find, when I do my work as a journalist, and I ask people I interview about the system, that the system itself becomes a really big feature of their story, and usually the experiences are pretty bad. And all the while, we can look at breaking down framing, which I guess this evening is really about, or seeking changes in the media, but we can miss the real power and often how corporate mainstream media reaffirms, supports, and covers news on behalf of those in power at the expense of us, especially the most vulnerable in our society. And despite the explosion of media forms since the digital revolution, mainstream media still plays an extremely important role in shaping how news in particular is consumed in Europe. The standard tropes and stereotypes that we get around migrants and refugees have a long heritage. We know this, and they are really hard to defeat. We are all trying to do it, I imagine, in our own ways, yet the success with which they are reproduced attests still to the continued power of the media to shape opinion and understanding around these issues. So for me as a journalist who's covered these stories at the borders of Europe for some years, it's an important moment for us to all stop and consider the stories that we tell, or the media tells about Europe and its citizens. We are living through, in Stuart Hall's term, a particular conjuncture in Europe and indeed across the globe. In the current political and global context, there is a tendency towards nationalism, xenophobia, populism, and anti-migration. I feel that displaced people are never really given the opportunity to have a voice in the European media. And while not every media outlet may set out to necessarily vilify migrants in their coverage, nonetheless, when migrants do appear in media coverage, they are represented as characters in other people's stories or as something other. And beyond this media framing, there is the political context, which we will hear about here later this evening. But in my own country, in the UK, we have seen the various recent scandals, such as the Windrush and the hostile environment. And of course, the UK is currently in the grips of the Brexit drama, and this election, one of the worst in years, and the very future of Britain in peril. For me, the decision of the UK to leave the EU is a decision to, I'm finding my space, where am I? Number 3. Here we go, sorry. It's a decision to reject a body of shared European values, the Britain of multiculturalism that I grew up on a council estate in North London, a working class migrant community. That experience, which felt open to the world, is now in real danger and replaced by one keen to blame migrants, progressive politics, and diversity for all of its ills. Okay, so now I want to, having mentioned some of the broad framing and issues around migrant representation, and Max just telling me I've got 5 minutes left, I'd like to briefly talk about the book, Lost in Media, which you can all buy outside. Lost in Media is taking this premise that migrants do not appear in media coverage. If they do, they are represented as other people's, in other people's stories, as characters or something else. Migrants are portrayed in extreme binaries, as vulnerable bodies or as dangerous outsiders, as silent actors, desperate whores, as statistics, never with their own stories. So in Lost in Media, we hope to reframe the boundaries of the public sphere and to illuminate the realities of contemporary Europe. I'd like to just pick a few contributors we have. In his essay, the award-winning journalist Daniel Trilling writes about the media's depiction of the migrant crisis, which was republished by The Guardian, long read, and he talks about how the media and politicians have really drawn up on a deep well of racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia as a way to argue for hard borders and nationalism rooted in the rejection of those labelled as non-European. For example, media stereotypes we know feed of ignorance and current climate of misinformation that we are all experiencing, and as editor Antonia Licinic discusses in the context of the Balkans. And for example, we have a conversation between Alexander Hemon and Diva Mohammed, two of the world's most important writers about what it means to be displaced. And in conversation, the acclaimed performance artist and activist Tanya Bugera argues that the risk for us is that this age of pessimism leads to inaction rather than building common bonds of experience. For Bugera, the great danger of our time, actually, is that we become too tired to keep up the fight. This book also includes images from Displaced in Media, and Displaced in Media was a project run by the ECF, the European Cultural Foundation, for a few years, involving a number of countries, also using the work of young refugees and migrants, and this book, Lost in Media, has come out of that project. We hope that this book, Lost in Media, and the images and the written in the book shows us that in these troubling times, as Tanya Bugera reminds us, we must not get tired, but rather build common bonds of experience. And of course, the media have a unique role to play in fostering such engagements and building shared values by giving space to migrants and refugees to tell their own stories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ismail and Nasha. Just say that for a little. I know the real Q&A is later, but I'd like things to be a little loosened up a bit. So one question for you now. You said during your speech several times, you mentioned the fact that you are a journalist yourself, yet you are criticizing the media. So how is it for you? Because for me personally, it's always a paradox, being so critical of the media, yet being part of that same institution and construct. How do you deal with that paradox?
Yes, I think the media remains an important a vehicle for us to tell stories. It's the way we communicate. It's changing. And I think as somebody who is an outsider, I think some of us in this room can really relate to this coming into the media in the UK. I don't know the Dutch context, but in the UK, it still remains overwhelmingly white and middle class and a kind of
I have statistics for you.
Yeah.
Holland, like from the 1,500 people that work in the Dutch media, till 2 years ago, it was 97% all white,
Yes.
and now it's 95.4.
So there is some
Last
success. But
Major improvement.
But Munir, to answer your question, I think it's a challenge, but I think this is why these spaces are so important. That's why I felt Displaced in Media was such an important project, and the work that's been done by so many people across Europe in different ways, media activists, people in the policy world, journalists, who are really trying to reframe the way we tell stories and saying to the media, you do not represent us and you are not speaking for us. And actually, to get a really fair democratic society, we need a media that reflects all of us in all the diversity we come in.
But you would call yourself a journalist still?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's my profession. That's the first thing I would always call myself, yes.
All right, okay. We will discuss more later. For now, I would like to invite our other speaker, Donya Alinejad. She is a postdoctoral researcher at Utrecht University, at the Faculty of Media and Culture, or Department of Media and Culture, and a teacher at Amsterdam University College, and also one of the founders of Crisis Magazine, which official online launch is today. Shout out. I guess you worked very hard to arrive at that moment, so let's celebrate. It aims to critically examine the causes and wide implications and effects of what is being called the migrant crisis, quotation marks, obviously. And you can explain much more, I guess, about the whole crisis, Meg, because it was such a beautiful poetic description, but it would take 5 cards at least to read it all out. So I leave the floor for you.
Thank you, Munir, for the introduction. Yes, as mentioned, we recently went live with our new web publication, Crisis Magazine, and this is the project that I want to speak with you guys about tonight. So I'll tell you a bit about the magazine, a bit about who we are, but most importantly, I'll say a bit about the wider political context in which we initiated this project and some of the particular political commitments that we have. So I'll stay on this slide, looks nice. To cut to the chase, basically, we were struck by how powerful and persistent the frame of the migrant crisis has become and still remains since the 2015 peak in migration to Europe. And so launching in 2019 and as we go into 2020, we have a bit of time sort of in between to have reflected a bit, and this kind of is a moment where we can start to really think about what we're left with. So I want to say something about this framing, what it does, the framing of the migrant crisis, and 2 important narratives that I think fit into this frame. So I'll just interact with this object. Okay. So I think the most important and dominant narrative is the one from the right wing about migration, namely that migration is predominantly dangerous for those in the host receiving country, and that the solution to it is tougher borders. And you can see sort of variations of that, smarter borders, let's say, but it's also, it kind of all boils down to the same thing. It's a story about migration's problems and border solutions. Then we have the stories about the humanitarian responses, the narratives that about basically that migration has caused a humanitarian crisis, one at the EU's borders. It's an emergency, and it's an emergency that requires immediate relief and aid, let's say. And this is a story of many important initiatives that are that offer aid and solidarity at the border. In some cases, at increasingly high costs to those who are offering those activities and services. And these are kind of some of the examples that I've used to show how this this framing encapsulates these two narratives to this day. So these are examples from just recently this month. But I think I sort of wanted to point out how there's a narrative and a counter-narrative, but that they both fit into this crisis frame. Both stories focus on the dire consequences of migration at the EU's borders, in camps inside the EU, and they present an immediate emergency response necessary in the here and now. The problem that I think this crisis frame sort of throws at us, even though sort of it may seem like it's not, it can also be a sort of centrist framing, could also be kind of neutral. I think it does, in any case, uphold and place dominant the right-wing narrative of migration. This is the one that succeeds in this framing. And it also, most importantly for me, leaves little political space for an entirely alternative left-wing framing that goes kind of beyond these humanitarian responses and these immediate here and now issues. So this was basically what kind of bothered us, was the problem that we were kind of faced with. And we wondered, what might an alternative frame on migration look like? Oh, sorry. It's handy, I can see the reflection there, that's good. So what might this alternative frame look like, and do left-wing political perspectives have something to offer us here? So these are some pretty big, ambitious questions, and I'm sorry to disappoint you that we don't have the answers just yet. We just started in October 1st, so doing this. But we've made our start with the first issue, and so I'll say a bit about how we've tried to sort of put some steps forward. So I'll say first a little bit about how we came to this ourselves, who we are. So
Sorry,
yeah.
I never interrupt, but you've been saying we so many times. Who are we?
I'm just about to tell you that.
Great.
So this is Saskia Bass and myself. We set up Crisis Magazine and we co-edit it together. Saskia did her PhD in international relations and works in an NGO worked in the NGO sphere for Syrian migration issues, in particular in Jordan, where she was working for 2 years. My PhD was in anthropology, and I work in academia in media and migration. And we both, Saskia and I, both sort of shared quite some, let's say, leftist political leanings and grassroots experiences organizing in the past. So we sort of had these connections and sort of shared interests in this regard from before. And we were both interested in Syrian migration since it's the largest global migration increase that constituted the 2015 and 16 peaks. So does that answer your question? Okay. So much like what Ismail also mentioned about sort of the limitations and the narrow sort of understandings that were present in the news media, we noticed a couple of things about the way Syrian migration was being, and the Syrian sort of conflict was also being, was appearing in the news. First, there was almost no connection being made, and still very much by and large is absent, no connection being made between basically our lives and the sort of the struggles that, especially political struggles that we face, that Syrians had been sort of in a different setting and in different degrees and in different forms, resisting and standing up for against the regime that they were protesting since 2011 during the Arab Spring. And therefore, so related to that, there was very little understanding of how relatable their motives were for resisting their sort of violently oppressive, sectarian, identitarian, almost fascistic regime. Then related to that lack, I think there was this very sort of narrow and lacking discussion of what the root causes for Syrian migration was then, right? So related to this lack of what is the uprising even about, why did it start out? So that we sort of thought about this as an entry point to thinking about, okay, how can we get past these simplistic assumptions about sort of everybody in the Middle East obviously wants to migrate to Europe because it's better here, right? And not asking like, why is it better? What is the difference exactly? What are the similarities, but what are the inequalities perhaps? So indeed, yeah, only 10% of, as you also mentioned, only 10% of Syrian migration actually reaches the borders of Europe in refugee status. Most of it is in the region. So we can't sort of satisfy ourselves with this explanation, like Europe is just such a great magnet for everyone in the world, right? So I think that we sort of have seen Syrians, we've sort of seen Syrians depoliticized in their struggle and not sort of heard, kind of ignored in this facet of what they collectively initiated. But we do this, I think, not only at their peril, but also at our own. And that's because of the ways that we have since seen how increasingly implicated we in Europe are in relation to this conflict. It sort of impinges on us in various different ways, right? Just think of the national level discussions in many EU countries about the Islamic State returnees that are citizens, or international discussions of crimes against humanity that are being committed unimpeded. So this sort of these issues that in the end we did too little too late to actually prevent, and now are kind of we're seeing the sort of backlash of. So what was particularly striking to us as also people with sort of leftist progressive leanings was that perhaps some of the leftist leaders were kind of letting us down on this in particular. So from Corbyn in Labour in the UK to Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany in Die Linke, to Varoufakis in DM25 in Greece, leftist leaders only opposed across the board their own government's military interventions and denounced Western bombings. So EU actions. But as we argue in our editorial introduction of the first issue, quote, the positions of these leftist leaders appear out of touch with the reality in Syria, where the vast majority of the conflict's estimated 500,000 civilian deaths has been caused by the Assad regime. Given the sustained failure of diplomacy via the UN Security Council due to Russia's paralyzing veto, European non-intervention, however well-meaning, translates into acquiescence to Assad's violence, end quote. So we saw this need for making expertise and in-depth knowledge in response to these gaps more accessible, more available, and for sort of cultivating this perspective of very sort of closely connecting what happens inside the EU with what happens outside, right? The sort of complex dynamics that are happening in our world. So we wanted to do this work of translating the academic knowledge that was already there into digestible forms, but we also wanted to sort of bring that into more public debates and current issues a little bit by placing it alongside the work of journalists, of prominent activists from the countries themselves, in this case, Syria. So I'll just give a very sort of brief touch of the sort of a couple of the articles that we have in the first issue, just because I only have a couple minutes. So for instance, we have Yassin al-Haj Saleh, who's an important Syrian leftist intellectual and activist who was imprisoned by the Assad regime for many years. After his release, he became an influential voice in publishing pieces that had relevance for the Syrian revolutionaries and activists organizing themselves in the early stages of the uprising before he was exiled to Turkey and then Germany. So the piece that he writes for Crisis offers us an analysis of the character of the Assadist regime as sectarian to the point of being genocidal. And he thinks through the implications of this for the Syrian resistance, but also for understanding more broadly how sectarianism and deep identitarian divisions have the seeds of violence sort of embedded within them. So his emphasis has broader implications for understanding our current moment in which we see a cross-national rise of autocratic style regimes on the right and people's resistances against them. So we have a few other pieces that go into the Syrian context, economically, historically, sort of about the neoliberal and authoritarian marriage in the Assad dynasty, the prison system. And then we go to the cases of those who left. So those who went to Turkey, who moved within the region to various different, who fled basically. And so we kind of go into explanations of what happens to the Syrian refugees in Turkey, but also what happens on an international scale in terms of how refugees become the sort of pawns in these compacts and deals that are made with the EU, and sort of go into how refugees have, in both cases, within the national context of Turkey and in these international compacts, become this kind of bargaining chip, become instrumentalized, become a sort of source of financial gain. And these are, in part, deals that our nation states are using as sort of supposedly successful ways of managing the crisis. So we have a few articles on that, and then finally we get closer to Europe itself, and in Germany we have anthropologist Nitzan Shoshan, whose piece is about how the arrival of the refugees in 2015 contributed to the rise of the AfD in Germany. So on the basis of his long-term ethnographic research that he conducted while he was embedded with right-wing groups, young neo-Nazis, he shows how the AfD channeled people's dissatisfaction with the hardships that they experienced in 2008 and sort of harness that to bring it together with then the already existing anti-elitism that had been sort of cultivated through the dissatisfaction at the economic situation, sort of then brought that together, culminated perfectly in 2015 with the rise of the refugee flow to sort of lead to the success of that party in Germany. So this is sort of to give you that overview. I'll sort of just end on summing up and saying something very briefly about what I think this focus on Syria has shown us. I think that Syrians are one of the groups now that are still, by and large, as Ismail also mentioned, these proper refugees or the good migrants that had arrived in the proper way. Even though that itself is also being undermined by pushes to claim that Assad has taken power again, and so Syria is stable, so it's time to go back. Actually, Leila Al-Shami writes about that in the issue as well. But we can acknowledge that indeed Syrians were this sort of real refugees, let's say, according to these discourses. And yet, it's telling that it was the migration flow that they primarily made up that triggered this crisis frame, right? So both in the media and in policy discussions. So what does that tell us about how we see refugees now? And I think this is very striking and may reveal more about what our sort of situation is more globally, but also as European residents and citizens. So here I just sort of want to briefly venture away from the content of the issue and say just two sort of quick last things that I think are basically the sort of two sides of the same coin. First, I think that what we are shown here is how little we properly understand the nature of the conflict in Syria and how little we have sort of really made an effort to do that. And I think we have to sort of acknowledge the knee-jerk reactions of military intervention or non-military intervention. It's sort of, if not complicit, kind of ineffectual. And it's also sort of made us, it has exposed the sort of lacks of the international peace mechanisms and institutions that we hold up as precisely relevant in situations like this. So that's kind of revealing, I think, with regard to the context broader than Syria alone. And I think this is also becomes more and more relevant in a context, in a global context, where populations are organizing uprisings and being met with heavy-handed violent responses by their corrupt rulers at the moment across different parts of the Middle East and Latin America as we speak. And so the question is, can we tell these people, oppose tyranny, we're behind you, right? We have your back, and can they believe that? And sort of what does that say about where we stand on opposing tyranny? And so in relation to that point, and this is really my last one, I think we've learned how ill-equipped we are in terms of our regimes of migration management to deal humanely with the mobilities that result from the kinds of conflicts that I've mentioned. And this is a context where projections of mass migrations due to conflict arising from climate issues are projected as actually taking the same routes as we have seen people fleeing war and poverty taking. So how far do we have to still come before we realize these mechanisms are flawed? I think this makes it all the more urgent and important for grassroots initiatives, maybe even especially grassroots initiatives, because they're small and nobody else is going to come and do it for us, so we're just going to start and see what happens. I think it's important for initiatives like that to...
Last point was last point.
Yes. Formulate radically new alternative frames and narratives, opening up new ways of understanding conflict and responding to the deep causes of human mobility. I think we desperately need these new frames, ones that necessarily take internationalism, solidarity, and human dignity at their core. Thank you guys for listening.
All right. Okay, that was Dunya Ali-Nejad. We had a lot of last points.
Sorry.
And you still have a Q&A, so you can make many more last points as well. I would like both of you to sit down now on this comfy chair, or couch, better said. And while you were both speaking, I was blown away by the interconnectedness of everything. But to start with the first question, which I think is actually a very necessary one, you both use the words refugees and migrants, and sometimes for the same people as well, I noted. So can you maybe clarify, because for me, and maybe that's because out of the Dutch context, a migrant and a refugee ain't really the same. And the moment Dutch media started to call, for example, Syrian refugees migrants, I was like, ooh, this is wrong. Because now you're actually hiding in the choice of words that these people are not coming here for economic reasons or something like that, but that they are forced due to situation to flee. So can you give a short comment on the definitions here before we start talking about migrants and refugees like it's all one big and the same thing?
So, am I talking to the mic? Yeah. So I think I see what you mean by this, but I think there's also the question of, is there such a clear distinction between economic migrants and refugees to begin with, outside of the sort of legal apparatus that distinguishes for good reasons those who are fleeing violence from those who are not.
Or political conscious reasons. Or
Right.
Yeah.
Is that then a good reason to say, okay, refugees are in a category that we look at as okay, and migrants are, well, just economic and therefore less valid? I mean,
That's another question. But
yeah, the
are the words the
association-
same or not for you?
I think the meanings, the associations with the words, if you try to make it very hard and fast that this is a refugee and that is a migrant, I think you also run the risk of reproducing another line where you're saying these people are valid and those people are not. And we see already the flaws of that, because people who are using this discourse of saying, well, I would like to let the refugees in, not just anyone, also are not serious about that, because they also respond very radically against the arrival of refugees. So,
but then you constantly choose to reclaim the meaning of what it means to be a migrant, right? Yeah. Okay, that's clear, just for everyone to understand. I'm not either opposed or in favor. I just want for us all to be very clear about the definitions we use, as there is already so much misinformation. Is this your same pick on the
Yeah, well, I think the definitions matter hugely, and they depend where you are in Europe. So if you're in the Netherlands, if you're in the UK, they're very different, or can be very different. But I think the key thing to remember is that refugees are migrants, and all migrants matter. And the key thing to remember is that, as Donia was saying, is that the differences often could be very minute. And as a journalist who's reporting on these stories, I'm not in the business of defining people's legal or otherwise status. The key thing to remember is that if you'll say, let's take the story of Taka, who I spent many years reporting about. He was a young Gambian who arrived in Europe some years back in Sicily, where I met him in 2016. And Taka, I actually went back and did a story for the BBC, and where I went to tell the story from the other side and travel to Western Gambia, where his family live. And he, like many young migrants from his country, left poverty, but not necessarily war. The Gambia had a dictator, Yahya Jammeh, who was very brutal. But Taka, that's his nickname by the way, his name is Babakur. But Taka, as he likes to describe himself, came as what is called an economic migrant, but then he experienced horrendous things via Gambia, Niger, into Libya, via the Libyan civil war. He was tortured. And by the time he arrived in Italy, he was classed as an economic migrant, not a refugee, deserving of the same legal protection. But who is a refugee? And I think we need to be more radical here, Munir. And I think what I found, final point, really problematic about all of this, and I think you were saying in your presentation, Donia, about who is called a refugee, who isn't, is so inherently political. The very word refugee, the very definition of it, were created because of the crisis of post-war Europe, because of 1945 and the aftermath of that. And the legal architecture we have, the UN Convention, and so on, I think are deeply Eurocentric. And they don't really deal with the realities and complexities of people on the move today.
So is that the first challenge then, to really redefine these words in the media and give them new meaning and faces?
No, I don't think it's about redefining. I think it's about understanding the nuances and the complexities. I use migrant, which is the BBC policy, as opposed to other media organizations, which, for example, Adhere during the crisis said they describe everybody on the move as refugee, which I found very problematic, because as you were saying, for example, someone who's Afghani or Iraqi or Gambian isn't considered a refugee in the sense of refugee, but they could have equally had really difficult journeys and deserve protection and so on. So I think rather than redefining things, I think we need to ask why we have these terms and do these terms fit into the reality in which we live today.
But would you then, if you could choose yourself and wasn't prone to the BBC regulations, would you then rather use refugees like Al Jazeera does, or stick to migrants?
I prefer to use migrants or displaced persons because I think they encompass the totality of different people moving or people on the move. I think there's a lot of different terminology, and actually in Lost in Media we explore this in the book because people in the collection describe newcomers, displaced person, racialized people, because, you know, migration, it comes in so many, you know, nuances and complexities. And I think the question isn't definition. I think the question is we have to ask the reality in which we live and the reality of people on the move, you know, what you call irregular migrants, the people who are coming from Gambia, say, or Senegal. The situation with Afghanis, you know, now people consider Afghanistan as somehow a safe country. We know it isn't, but the reality is that there's thousands of Afghanis who are in limbo in Greece and in a lot of other countries. So these definitions don't matter so much. What matters is the reality on the ground and the experiences of these people and reflecting those experiences in the best nuance that we can in the media.
So, Donya, you spoke about the term migrant crisis, right? And the refugee crisis, and it became all a crisis. But is there a specific year or moment in time that media started to frame the issue as such?
Yeah, we basically take 2015 as the starting point. Of course, you can say that like the term has circulated for longer. I think the sentiment has definitely circulated for much longer. But the nomenclature of the migrant crisis really started with this 2015, 2016 peak that
when
there was a
the
response
first
to.
larger groups of Syrian refugees started to hit Europe.
Yeah, when the policy response started to really have to have something to say about what to do about this, and various different meetings were held, and these terms were used in the press.
When I was in The Hague last week in a program about fear, there was this Belgian political scientist who said that there were several Belgian politicians and members of parliament who spoke about 2 million Syrian refugees hitting Belgium. And he mentioned that altogether there are only 600,000, which is a lot, of course, but given the 2 million, there are only 600,000 Syrian refugees currently in Europe or around Europe in camps. And that of them, the largest group is in Germany and Austria, and so Belgium is actually dealing with a much smaller number, yet no journalist somehow thought it important to do a fact check and point this out. And when this political scientist mentioned these numbers to the audience, to my surprise, the audience was really amazed that we were speaking of 600,000 Syrian refugees or migrants in total for Europe. Which made me remember again how little we know about the statistics and facts, although you don't want to make people statistics, but apparently the statistics do matter, because otherwise it takes whole different shapes in our head. How do you deal with this, like giving a voice to people and their faces, like which you did with your video program that we will also watch it later, where you give people very clear voice and name and, you know, and take them out of the number, yet in the same time having these clear statistics that make things just maybe a little less scary and more comprehensible somehow?
Yeah, I think both are equally important. I think journalists or journalism is usually in the business of humanizing, what they say, stories. And actually, Nazreen Malik of The Guardian writes an essay in the collection where she talks about the problem of humanizing. It can also be quite negative because you may get this idea of a good, you know, migrant or refugee. In this case, she talks about a chap from Syria who runs a falafel hummus stall in London. And, you know, it's a good story and it fits into kind of these ideas that we have about the good sort of refugee or migrant. I think the facts point, Munir, is really important because I think much of the coverage since 2015, since the so-called crisis hit the headlines across Europe, we've had a dearth of fact which has led the coverage. And the reality is very different if you look at the numbers of Syrians on the move that are already in Europe claiming asylum. And if you look at the situation when it comes to actually where conflict happens, and I think that's what's so good about your magazine, Donya, that it questions this idea of not only the numbers, but also the connection between what happens in Europe and what is happening in other places. So, you know, can we look at the situation in Libya and not remember that David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy led a military intervention in Libya? That is part of the story. Why don't we hear about this? When we hear stories and depictions of black bodies in Europe, we should look at the slave connections, and we should look at the slave depictions, and we should look at the colonial history. And it's amazing because in Europe, as Lubiana Himid, the artist, says in the book, there's a collective amnesia about these things in Europe. And as a regular visitor to the Netherlands, I do think this country has an issue with this too. That, you know, and you have your Zwarte Piet and all kinds of odd things that continue, which baffles people outside this country. So the reality is that there's all this going on, and you know, we talk about migrants and refugees, but yet we're not talking about the realities of Europe and its history. You know, these histories are not free of violence.
Okay, but then
Europe was born in violence at the expense of the rest. Amsterdam was built because of the Dutch Golden Era, which was built on the back of the transatlantic slave trade. I'm sorry, but these histories matter. And these histories are woven into the realities of migration today.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, but I want to ask one last question for now, because we're running out of time. So you both mentioned context a lot, and I love the things you showed us as a brief overview of what we could expect when we would visit Crisis Mag. Also, I thought, whoa, that's not an easy read on your Monday morning while running to work. So how do we bring in, to be the devil's advocate here, because I love my long reads. I mean, I write for the Groene Amsterdam because I have 5,000, 6,000 words to my disposal. But what if you are that person that reads and with a new, like, if they still read a newspaper, or just quickly, looks over some headlines on your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed while running to work or coming back from school. Like, how do you deliver the context even to a less informed, maybe less educated, and maybe it's also slightly less interested audience? They might become interested when they read more, but I mean, not every general person would, I think, out of itself, go read all the larger long reads on your Crisis Mag.
I think you're right, and I think I would actually want to turn it around and say that's not our job. So we are doing an initiative that we think should and can influence those who are actually writing for larger audiences and writing in the languages of the countries that they are writing for. And I think we make kind of a misstep when we think that people who are reading the news are the ones whose mentality is actually shaping the way that policy and media discussions, and it's those people that we have to first reach before we reach anyone else. I mean, no, the media frames are shaping how those people think.
Yes, because
so if we influence the media frames, then, I mean, and that is speaking to people in a language that is accessible indeed, and we do our best, and we sort of try to work with, form and style and things like that. But to speak to those who are actually a bit more in positions of power and have more responsibility to do a better job, in the same way that you were describing about sort of holding the media to account. Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask much more, but I will turn to you now. Anyone, a question? Max is walking around with a microphone. No one? Okay, yeah, there's a question over there. Briefly introduce your name and your pronoun, please.
Oh, hello, my name is Carla. And I want to go back to the question of migrant and refugee. I went to the presentation of Lost in Media in the summer, and Daniel Trilling was talking exactly about the term migrant. And in his opinion, migrant has gained a pejorative meaning. And for me, although I understand what you said about refugees and migrants, I'm thinking if a journalist had to write about this subject, how is it possible to remove this charge from the word, even if we want to portray here the reality of the person that we are pretty much focusing on and their experiences.
Ismail.
Carla, right? Thank you so much, and thank you so much for writing about the event last time. I think Daniel, you should read if you can. Daniel's long read, which was an essay from the book in The Guardian, and it's called How the Media Contributed to the Migrant Crisis. And it was really interesting because people were tweeting, saying, you're talking about the media crisis, but it says media crisis in the title. And I think it just tells me something really interesting about the media and the way it works is that as a journalist who's reporting these stories, often there's a newspaper with their own policies, there's an editor, there's a copy editor, there's a whole structure that goes into how this is framed. I take a point, Carla, I think it's a very important point because Daniel says, actually in the essay, but also in his book, which everyone should read, Lights in the Distance, he says, that the migrant wasn't really used to describe people. It's actually a more scientific term. And it's become much more of a recent thing in terms of the usage in the media.
Okay, but there's a popular connotation to the term, which of course makes it very difficult.
Yes.
Because I, as a journalist, might think, okay, no, but I'm using a different definition with using migrant.
Yes.
But the general audience will still perceive it as the migrant as used by political, by political figures and by popular culture.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the key question, I think you're trying to get to, I'll say it briefly, is how do we, decontextualize? How do we textify that word so that it can be used in a way which has all these bad baggage? And the answer to that is I don't know exactly how we do that, but I think one of the key things we can do, which I said already, is focus less on the definitions and the realities of people on the move. So maybe we need to start working and rethinking these terminologies. And again, I just said, these terminologies largely come from 1945, the whole notion of refugee, all of this stuff.
But should we come up with whole new terms then altogether?
Well, I think the world has shifted, and I think the nature of people on the move, as Donya and I were saying, is you can't tackle. I mentioned that story briefly. His story exemplifies this experience because he has had some horrendous things happen to him, but most people say he left by choice, therefore he's an economic migrant, and he's not deserving of asylum, and he's not, therefore, the same league as a Syrian refugee.
And I would say also, it depends on the setting in which you are. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to what word you should use. It also depends because, for instance, with the case of Turkey, just the word refugees also means different things in different countries. So in certain countries, UNHCR, refugee international policies are instated and upheld and kept in place. In Turkey, that's not the case. There's a special refugee kind of guest status, which is the refugee status that is offered, and that's also called refugee status. So legally, it doesn't have the protections that an international convention offers, but it is also thrown in. So if you're writing that story, it's important to say the difference between that refugee and this refugee meaning, right?
Again, more context.
Yeah.
Yet I got the sign from Max that I have to wrap this up, so I'm very sorry. But thank you, Ismail and Nasha and Donya Linejad. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please take your seat. Yes, applause. We have a very condensed program here, so I have to be like on the clock. We will now watch several short videos, which were part of the Displaced in media program that is also then part of the book, and the stills of the videos will be found in the book, yet the stories are in video. So, and it was a project in which people got the chance to tell their own story, narrate it from their own perspective, and the videos were shot in 2017.
Allô, mon nom est Thierry. T'inquiète, ça va aller, Inch'Allah. avec les jaquettes et les vestes tous les jours. J'ai besoin de soleil, man. Il est toujours froid ici. Pas de soleil. Mais dis-moi, pourquoi tu veux venir en Europe? Il y a ta famille, tes frères et sœurs. Et pourquoi tu veux te sacrifier de venir en Europe? Moi, je ne pourrais pas t'expliquer aujourd'hui. Et c'est une histoire très longue. C'est une histoire très très compliquée. Et c'est difficile à raconter. Mon ami, je te souhaite que du bonheur. Mon ami, je veux que du bonheur de toi. Mais avant de te sacrifier, pense à tes familles et tes frères et sœurs d'abord. Mon ami, avant d'arriver en Europe, c'est le voyage de l'enfer. Soit tu meurs dans l'eau, soit tu meurs dans le désert. Et si Dieu merci que tu es arrivé en Italie vivant, tu dégoûteras de manger et dormir. Rien à faire que manger et dormir. Et si tu veux venir en France pour gagner une vie meilleure, à 28 000 ans, va te dégoûter. Tu marches sur les montagnes, de rentrer à Molton Caravane, les policiers vont te retourner à 28 000 ans. Tu prends le train, arrivé à la frontière, les policiers vont te donner un papier qui est écrit au-dessus, refusé de rentrer en France. Et si tu as réussi à rentrer un jour en France, c'est la découverte d'une nouvelle vie. La gare Saint-Charles, je dis bien la gare Saint-Charles, tu seras là-bas dans le froid, minimum 3 mois, peut-être après ça peut aller. Mon ami, s'il te plaît, je vais dormir. Je serai à l'école demain et je dois me réveiller à 6 heures pour me laver, prier, déjeuner avant d'aller à l'école. Ça me fait 1 heure avant d'arriver à l'école. Donc désolé, mon ami, je vais dormir.
What's up, guys? I am Maram. So, I live in Istanbul. When I moved to Istanbul, it was the... Why people looking at me? Hello? When I moved to why I can't talk it? When I moved to Istanbul, it was the biggest step in my life because I left my school and my friends and my town. So, Istanbul, it's so big. I came to Istanbul illegally way because I am Palestinian Syrian and the Palestinian Syrians can't get a visa to cross the borders. When I came here, I just sat at the home for 1 week. After that, I find a job in a factory. I worked there for 2 weeks. I'll tell you why. The work here is so hard. Also because I am underage and I can't find like nice job. So I worked here in a factory and it was like for 13 hours at the day. It's my sound. It's so hard. I was like working 13 hours at the day and he was just giving me 20 euros every week. And it's not good enough to pay for my family and for our home here. Hello? I am working here now. After that, I sat at the home for. I didn't like go to the job. I worked for 2 weeks.
Jag är trött på att missa mitt liv på grund av att jag måste bevisa vem jag är.
Jag är trött på att behöva vara övertydlig så att jag inte blir missuppfattad.
Jag är trött på att läsa avslag efter avslag.
Trött på att inte våga gå nära spåret ifall någon skulle putta mig framför tunnelbanan. Jag är trött.
Jag är trött på att vara vaken varje sekund på grund av situationen.
Jag är trött på att behöva bevisa att jag är som du. Jag är trött.
Jag är trött för att vara rädd för att någon ska ta mig härifrån.
Jag är trött på att se mig omkring efter människor som vill göra mig illa.
Jag är trött för att min pappa behöver oroa sig för mig när jag lämnar mitt hem.
Jag är trött på att behöva bevisa att jag inte är folks fördomar. Jag är trött.
Jag är trött på att vara ledsen i hjärtat varje dag. Trött på att folk ser ner på mig. Jag är trött.
Jag är trött. Jag är trött.
All right. It's now time for the second round, in which I would like to focus a little bit more on the Amsterdam/national perspective. I have three guests for this talk, the Q&A. Hidayah Nampina, she is the co-founder of American City Rights. Please, a warm applause. Take your seat, Hidayah. Baba Terawali, author, journalist, so many things basically. Welcome, Baba. And JC Veldhuizen, who is a social entrepreneur, and he is working for Amsterdam Bijeen at the municipality. Thank you. All right, you will have to share the mics, I hope you don't mind. I'll also try to leave a little more time for the audience, because I think it's wrong for me only to ask questions. I mean, let's try to keep it democratic. The first question I want to ask you, Hidayah, because not everybody might know, what does Amsterdam City Rights really entail?
Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
And
I'm
other
sorry,
people.
my voice is a bit very small, but I think it's okay. Well, by name, like he said, Hidayah Nampima. I come from Uganda, and I've been in Amsterdam for approximately 2 years. Well, I come to speak for people in Limbo. That's why we started Amsterdam City Rights. Amsterdam City Rights was formed on the basis of how best we could integrate with the Dutch citizens and also the migrants, the refugees, and undocumented people. To be specific, there's a lot that's happening around, especially in Amsterdam, that we are not really accepted. I suppose if you found me on the streets, you wouldn't know whether I am undocumented or not. We are basically being judged. So basically, Amsterdam City Rights was formed with the basis of integrating the Dutch citizens with the undocumented people.
And you were mentioning there are many things at play here in Amsterdam. Can you give some recent examples?
Well, in this very place, a couple of months ago, I was giving a speech about what are some of the reasons why we leave our countries to Europe. I believe I wouldn't be here because I miss my family, I miss my mom, I miss my siblings. But everybody leaves home because there's danger. One of the people in audience attacked me verbally. She said, the media only says there's a political crisis in Uganda. There's really no problem in Uganda. Well, everybody is here for a specific reason, so you cannot really judge me for who I am or why I'm here. Yeah.
So people generalize, they say, well, your country is kind of safe,
Right.
so what the hell are you doing here? And they totally forget that they themselves can travel anywhere they want and live everywhere they want, basically.
Absolutely.
And nobody even wonders why. Baba, how long have you been in the Netherlands, if I may ask?
More than 20 years now.
Okay.
22 years.
I think as you worked in the media and you have always been following the media, have you seen changes in those 20 years, having this internal yet also maybe slightly external perspective on the issue?
Yeah, absolutely. When I came in the Netherlands in the 90s, a lot of people from Somalia and Yugoslavia. And at that time, I can compare the same time with now with Syria and Eritrea.
All right. As two major groups of
Two major
refugees.
groups. The one from Yugoslavia was more European, more accepted. They got status, and people from Somalia didn't have status at that time, so they lingered in the asylum center. Most of us from West Africa, other African countries, we are not accepted. So there was priorities to Yugoslavian. And I know 2015 to now, I see also the same pattern, that we have what I called that government is making choices, that people from Syria, most of them stay, and people from other African countries are not recognized as refugees. Like what my dear friend here is saying, for people from Uganda, Nigeria, Gambia, Senegal, other countries. Absolutely no.
And is that related to the politics, or is it also enforced by media frames of these specific groups?
It's about empathy.
Okay.
It's about empathy. With the Syrian groups, you saw a lot of empathy among Europeans, because of what happened, and the way the media framed it.
Yeah.
So in that aspect, when you see empathy, government react, policymakers react, because citizens feel for certain people. And because of that, policies are made to make sure that those people are also accepted to please their people, to please the voters. And then this is worrisome, because you see really division. Even the asylum centers, you see a lot of problems between two ethnic groups or countries. People don't accept each other because they think you are more giving priority, and we are not. And I see that happening because I give training to refugees. I train a lot of Syrians and Eritreans. I give them training. And to come back to the whole label of a migrant and who is not migrant, who is refugee, I tell the people I train that you are not a refugee. Don't accept that word that you are a refugee. You are an expert. Because when Western people go to Africa, we call them expert. But when we come here, we are refugees, we are migrants. So it's how you define yourself. Because when do you stop to be a refugee? Even me, more than 20 years, they still refer to me as a refugee. So when do I stop to be a refugee? I'm not a refugee. But that word has been so much negative connotation. And it is really denigrating to your humanness when that word is used all the time on you.
Sure. Yeah. And it's made an adjective to your being. Yet, okay, I can be Eritrean and say, from now on, I will call myself an expat. But actually, when you said it, some people were laughing. And I can see why, because the idea of an Eritrean expat sounds so bizarre, which is, of course, ridiculous, but apparently it does, and it leads to an instant reaction. So even though I will be Eritrean, hypothetically, and I would say, from now on, I'm going to walk around and claim myself for being an expat, just like any other white person to Eritrea, I will be considered an expat. Yet the media would still call you a refugee, and probably people in the street will not think of you as an expat, no matter what you claim to be.
True, it's about human connection. Like one of my columns I wrote for trial, let me say, a month ago, was about a Syrian guy who got status, and he came to me so happy that I've got my stay, and I'm going to, I'm getting a house. I said, where? Volendam.
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
We are laughing again because we can feel the pain.
Yeah, Volendam is a place where it's really right, extreme right. So he didn't know that, and I knew that you are going to a place where, woo. But the guy is very good with his hands. He's very technical. So I'm trying to teach him how to sell himself when he goes to Volendam. That is somebody who can work with his hands. He's somebody who has an expertise.
Yes.
So don't put emphasis on you being a refugee and so that people can get empathy for you, get sorry for you. Don't put attention on that. Put attention on what you can do for others, what you can do for humanity. So if you put attention on that, then you will not be seen as a refugee, because as somebody who comes to contribute to the society. And that is the mindset.
Is it really that easy, given the fact that we have so strong populist notions in debate and so many media frames that would constantly try to downplay you or bring you back to that refugee status, even though you have decided upon yourself that you're not one of them, whatever that is?
It's true, but it's how we use those words to label. Because we don't even talk about asylum seekers, because before you become a refugee, you're an asylum seeker, you're not a refugee.
Yeah.
Like if we look to Belgium, the Belgians, they use more decent words to describe asylum seekers. To be, they call you kandidaat vluchteling.
Kandidaat vluchteling, oh wow.
A candidate that will become a refugee. So they try to use the word in such a way that they call asylum seekers, they call them the asylum center, kleiner kasteltje. A kleiner castle. A small castle. Castle. So it's about words, and Holland, we use very direct words. Asylum seekers, Azizuka, Alochton, we have the words that are so much painful. And so I really agree how we should think about reframing those words, changing those names, trying to see people as humans and trying to see them with their qualities, with their dreams. Because most of these guys who come here, they're not lazy. They cross the desert, they cross the Atlantic Ocean, and they survived the Dutch winter.
Yeah, that's something on top of it.
So they're not lazy. These are people who have strength, but when they come here, the society make them feel very much as nothing.
But don't you put a lot of and JC, I will come to you and to you as well, Adhere, but don't you put a lot of pressure and focus on the people themselves to redefine themselves instead of the whole system that suppresses them and put them back in their box? I mean, of course, I love personal development and reclaiming yourself, and I'm constantly fighting my own battles in that. But in the same time, if you talk about media, I mean, I can call myself whatever I want, but in every interview, I find the same adjectives added to my name and the same recurring patterns also in the relationships thereafter. People who read an interview and then meet me will constantly remember me of those adjectives that I maybe don't want or try to throw away or whatever else.
It's true. Stereotypes, these are things that don't easily go away.
Yeah, that's it.
We have government or policies makers, they use that word refugee because they have to report back to the government, to the subsidy, that we gave certain amount of money to refugees. So they need those words. So it's difficult for them to change it. Because
did you manage to get free of the term refugee yourself?
Well, I always try to introduce myself in a very positive way. And I never say I'm Baba Tarawali from Sierra Leone, a refugee, an ex-refugee. I don't use those words. I use my expertise. When I meet, I'm a journalist, I'm a writer. So when I connect with people, I tell them what I can do, who I am. So if you learn to say who you are, because most refugees, I'm sorry to say that, because the whole asylum system, when you come to the agency, the COA, they make you so lazy, that your humanity is really down. And that whole stress makes you not to believe in yourself anymore. So my task is to try to get them out of that system, to give them more power, to say, listen, you can tell your own story. You can show who you are. They want to get empathy, but you don't have to give it to them.
Hidayah, do you agree on this?
I totally agree with him. Because for a number of occasions, because personally I was in the AZC for only 4 months. But in 4 months, I almost lost like 15 kilograms. I was crying all the time. I was in my own world. That when you're in the AZC, there's usually no connection with the people, especially your neighbors. I moved to like 4 AZCs in those 4 months, and just getting someone to say hello to you on the road was something I didn't see in those 4 months. But I always had this positivity in me that there will be a time when I'll have to express myself. And I'm very grateful when I came to Amsterdam, I got so many platforms to express the kind of person I am and what I can offer to society. Because mainly people in Europe always look at us as people just coming to take. They don't look at us as people who will give something. Personally, I am a certified electrical engineer, but I never got a chance to practice my profession because of the bureaucratic way in my country. But I believe if I'm given a chance, there's much more I can add to the society here.
Is this maybe also a way to just change the media frames by then living such a different reality than the media depicts you, that in the end, in the long run, in the interpersonal connection, the views do change?
Well, I think the media is very biased, and the media does not really interact with the people in the situation like us. Most of the news that we see is basically fake news. I'll give you an example of a friend of mine. She's Syrian, but she always tells me, like, when she first went to school, the teacher always asked her if they had cars, if they had a TV at home, if they had nice things in her country. So I believe there's so much lack of information from us. The media needs to have a very wide-based community of how best they can interact with the people in this situation, not just what you hear from another person and then you publish it without getting concrete evidence. I think that is really lacking in the media.
JC, Bijeen has been quite vocal about especially the rights of undocumented people in Amsterdam, I think, within the municipality council, and there has been a lot of crisis the last 2 years. 1 year of people being displaced, people being pushed from one place to the other, and a lot of news coverage that was very damaging to their cause. How do you reflect on that?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think if I reflect on that, I would have to say that the right-wing media and right-wing politicians are winning. Because, well, like everybody here already described, they managed to basically make their narrative the dominant narrative. And that's also what you see in Amsterdam. So, for example, right now there's supposed to be like a really left-wing city board, and they are doing some good things for undocumented refugees, like the 24-hour shelter for 500 people. But then it's problematic because it's just 500 places and hundreds of people are out on the streets and there's no facilities for them at all. And then what's also problematic is if you want to be part of this 24-hour shelter, then you have to agree that you will work on your own return. So although there is some improvement, especially since the last elections, you can still see that it's all within the same narrative of I would say like right wing narrative.
And what is that predominant narrative?
Eventually they would have to go home, and we don't have place for everybody, so there can just be 500 spots, and yeah.
So out of lack and shortage and lack of room and costs.
Yeah, and there's not enough space here, and there's not enough money. But of course, it's all about choices, and it's just a political choice that there's not enough space and that there's not enough money for this specific issue. Yeah.
Another thing that for me is always very striking is that there's actually very little news coverage, for example, in the Amsterdam local context, of real news and reports and real articles on migrants, refugees, but a lot of editorials. Editorials. And editorials describe a certain situation, but in editorials, of course, an opinion of someone. It's in fact an opinion piece. Baba, do you recognize this kind of editorial news in which it's not really clear if it's news or an editorial of someone?
Yes, I recognize that, but but then it brings me back to what you said earlier, that the right extreme, the media is winning the battle. So when they are on top of things, they decide who to give priority and what type of story to tell. So they don't really go into in depth about what it is. They don't have time for that. And so instead, it becomes an opinion or a small column, editorial. So they don't go deeper into that, because it is when you go deeper, when you go into the human interest story of a, let's call it, migrant refugee, then that is not the type of story their readers would like to read.
But at the same time, how do you prevent, then if you would make a human interest story, not to get the good migrant story?
The good migrant story.
Yeah, like was mentioned by Ismail, for example, and by Dunya. So sometimes you do have a very beautiful portrait of a person that, let's give the falafel shop owner, or you have so many other examples. Look, here in Friesland we have one Syrian refugee in this small town, or two actually, and they opened a bakery and everybody's eating the bread and they're all so happy. Sometimes you do have these kind of more left-wing oriented positive news, but it's of course then the good migrant and who succeeded somehow in this whole Cold Winter Holland. How do you look at that? Like, how do you prevent human interest from turning into this good migrant, bad migrant vibe? You can also, of course, respond to that. JC, you're...
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about something you said before, because I think, and I'm looking at Annette, I think lately, like the last year, 2 years, there have been some good, like, long reads in national media on undocumented refugees, mostly thanks to the undocumented refugees, like, doing actions themselves, and a lot of people asking for attention. So I think there has been some better media attention to this group and to this topic. But the thing is, 90% of all the media attention is about, oh, we are here squatted a place, and there was actually an entrepreneur in there, and yeah, well, most 90% of it is like bevestigen, yeah, confirming like the idea that these people, they are stealing, that they are thieves, that they are rapists, and even till the point that in one city council meeting, there were, I think, 50 to 100 people from a certain kind of neighborhood. They were coming to the city council to speak about a new, like, 24-hour shelter location opening in some neighborhood, and they were literally calling these people rapists, thieves, criminals. Our children will not be safe anymore. Yeah, this is Amsterdam. Yeah, and this is the result that you will see. Like Danya said, it's like when media, they write about this topic like this, and they write about these people like this, then the people, they will start believing it. And now we're actually at the point that in Amsterdam, the most left-wing, the most progressive city in the Netherlands, people are revolting against shelter for people who have absolutely no rights in this country. So that's, yeah, it's just scaring me.
I'm happy that you also focus on the good things that is happening in some media, but not all the media. Because I work with these refugees from New Dutch Connections. I work with refugees who are highly educated refugees. When I call the media to tell them we have this, our end event, they really show themselves, their qualities. They are not interested. Like even on file, we have lots of highly educated, qualified, talented people there. But the media is not interested in that. So the negative news is what sells. And that is the reason why I'm stressing on the fact that we also have a task. We, from the migrant background, refugees background, we have a task to reframe the story, to sell ourselves differently. And if we do that, we continue to come up, like what you are doing. I'm really proud of you. What you are coming up and speaking out. If we continue to promote that, then there will be a time we are in. The media has no other option but to really go with the flow, that these are people who are really here to contribute to the Dutch society. They're not only here to put their hands and collect money, but they are here to give back to the society. And that is the goal I'm fighting to achieve.
I am sorry, Max is really waving with his hand that I have to wrap this up. But Max, I'm going to give the audience two questions, okay?
You can, it was just a sign that you can give
okay,
space.
Okay, oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
We're still, first time working together, so that's why I don't really, okay. Thanks God, there is still time for some questions. So, are there any questions to my lovely panel here? Everybody's so shy, people.
Oh.
Okay, the others, okay, good.
Yeah, for Jazzy.
Your name first, please, pronoun.
My name is Marka, floating pronoun, queer. Jazzy, so you work like with heart and soul as a politician. You work with heart and soul. Met je hart en ziel ben je betrokken. But I'm wondering, to my sense, the political system we have is deeply tied to the nation state. We have national systems. So that even if you would imagine that in Amsterdam, you would start having a kind of radical humanity for people, regardless of status, right? Wouldn't the simple effect of that be that at the national level, they would step in and they would suppress it?
Very clear question.
Yeah, well, I think they would definitely do that, and I think they have already. I think they already did that. I think they're already threatening, especially Rutger Groot-Wassink, but the city board in general. Like, hey, if you're gonna like go too far with this undocumented refugee shelter, we're gonna make sure that this subsidy right here is gonna be pulled back. So I'm quite sure they're already doing that. Yeah, how to deal with that? I'm not sure, but I think we have to be like, well, they say Amsterdam is a human rights city. They say Amsterdam wants to be a fearless city. So then I say, well, if you say that, then do it. Then fuck the national government. We just make sure that in
No
Amsterdam,
effort.
all human rights are yeah, everybody has human rights. So we should live up to that.
You showed a lot of heart and soul, but let's try to stay away from the cursing though.
Excuse me.
For the sake of the live stream and other purposes. Another question. Everybody's scared now? No. Okay. There's a
Sure. Well, it's difficult to choose because there are a lot of things that I would like, but maybe they. This morning I was reading in Le Monde that France was this year having the most number of refugees, and in that article, the reaction of the minister in charge in the French government was to call this a statistic anomaly. So it was, I think it was putting very much the frame that we are in now. But is it the media? Because the media was not questioning this at all. It was just carrying it over.
to the minister in charge.
Yeah, so who is it? Is it the politics, the way they are now, that are actually conveying this, or is it the media? What is the interaction?
The chicken and egg question.
How can you break this? Because we need to break this in the end.
Anyone? Baba, maybe?
Yeah, it is, you know, when I speak to Dutch politicians, I always tell them refugees did not just come here because they want to be here. You know, when you sell guns, you get refugees in return. That is just simple mathematics. You know, you bring fire there and they need safety, or things are not going the right way. And one thing also which I also stress on is the fact that, you know, like if you look at the African continent, you cannot live there and come here with a visa. It's not almost impossible. The whole restriction of visa restriction to African countries is so problematic. And people are looking for ways, you know, to leave their countries as adventurers also, to travel. The world has been globalized in the sense also that multimedia, we are all on internet, we are all on...
Okay, but if we bring it back to the question of the interaction between politicians and media, because of course you're saying like the article actually itself is just stating statistics and then the minister is naming it an abnormality. But at the same time, was the journalist criticizing or questioning the statement of the minister?
No, not at all.
So then it's reinforcing. When you're printing something without another take on it. And so this becomes the only take. But it's my logic, my common sense here. I don't know. Do you agree, Donia, as a researcher? In an instance like that?
What is the question now?
So, well, if a newspaper states this statement of the minister that it's an abnormality that there's so many refugees in France, and it's not criticizing that or asking any questions to the minister about this quite extreme hyperbolic use of words, I would say then it's just reinforcing what the minister said.
I would say it's bad journalism.
That's another way of taking it. But do you have any view on the chicken and egg question? Like, is it media or is it politics who are actually shaping these frames?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the cop-out answer is it depends on events and particular situations, but by and large, I mean, they are playing into each other, right? I mean, we see the way that this happens with the way that policy discourses circulate in media discussions and debates. We know that there's a rise of right-wing figureheads in politics, in part because they receive a lot of media attention, right? So there's clearly something rotten in both institutions that is related to one another. I don't know if it's useful to think about it in terms of one simply impacting the other, and so you should just target the root of the problem in one single place and then it will go away. I think these institutions we have to kind of do the complex work of challenging power in
both.
In both, yeah.
Ismail, it seemed like you wanted to say something or add something to this.
Then I will.
Oh, I thought you.
I was just interested in listening to Dunya. Yeah, I think it's a really important question that you raised, and I think in the end, the real question to me is less about, it's certainly bad journalism, but I think it's less about, which came first, and actually much more about the state of democracy and where democracy is in Europe. And the fact that we've stopped believing in those in power, and we need to trust politicians again, and we need to trust the media again. And this is a real crisis of democracy that goes to the very heart of what the nation state, you were saying, does. And also it's really interesting what Jassy is saying about the fact that in Amsterdam, I didn't know this, but you have left-wing kind of politicians that are basically doing right-wing things. So I think also the traditional left-right split also is in decline. So I think we have a real crisis of value and democracy, and those are the big questions that we all face, I'd say.
Now that I'm speaking to you anyway, I have a question as well. I was wondering what you thought of what Baba said and Hadaya about reclaiming your own status as a human who is called a refugee or a migrant or anything else like that.
Yeah, I think what Baba's saying and Hidaya is really true. I agree with that. I think identities are complex, and I think it depends where you are in different countries. But again, we had this in the gay movement, in the women movement, in so many different movements, reclaiming the word, which is often derogatory, racialized, so on. I think it's really important. And, this whole process is also really important in terms of reimagining the public space and talking about representation and getting a much more democratic and fair society, so we don't have this kind of failure of democracy, really.
Is there one last question of the audience? Yes.
Thank you. I will be quick, but it's a comment in general about public opinion and citizens, because we are talking about politicians, about the media, but at the end of the day, citizens, we vote for politicians and we follow the media, and at the end of the day, we are the customers of both of them. So what is the role and the responsibility that we have? And in the context of cities like Amsterdam, it's an international city with many tourists, people doing international business, and how we can reframe and think about migration in a different way, because being a tourist or being a international student on an expat is really cool, and we all want to be that, right? But then how we can reframe this, go back to the politicians and the media, and basically in cities like Amsterdam, where we have all the rights to be here when we are from some countries but not from others, how we can reframe the whole topic of migration in capital letters, because migration, the definition of an immigrant is a person that moved from one place to another looking for better life conditions. We all want that, right? So basically, for me, the question is, I love these places. I always like conference, city, places like this. But my question is how we can create spaces for the people who are not here, who will never come to places like this because they really are not open to talk about migration. So what can we do about that?
This is a super big last question. Love it. But what's your name?
Noemi.
Sorry?
Noemi.
Noemi. Okay.
I would just say one thing about that. Only one thing. Yeah, the question is very clear for me.
Yes.
And I think we need to go back to the whole concept of humanity. We need to create communities that believes in humanity. Because what I see is that politicians, they look to what the people want. The media look to what the readers want. So what I am trying to do is to create a community space for people in Amsterdam, people in Holland, who will, really have a sort of connection with this group. The more we become bigger and bigger, then we can change the narrative to the media and the politics.
Okay. Are you satisfied with that answer? not completely, I think.
I think about communities, connecting people. How we can create the spaces where people connect.
Yeah, that's it. I don't just want to talk more about New Dutch Connection, what we do, because we work with refugees and migrants. We give them coaches and bodies. We create a network. We make sure that you are here as a person. Before 3 months, you have more than 200 people who knows you. You know, we make exposure, and you get a coach, you get a body. This body helps you to learn to know their community. It takes you to birthday parties and their communities. And before you know, like what you said you are here, you say hi to people, don't even say hi back, or it's difficult to get connection. So we bring people out of the centers to really make sure that they get connection, so that they know them, And when they create their own community, their own space, then it makes it easier for them to believe in you. The disadvantage of that is that, like in my own situation when I came to Holland, I went to the church. I was born a Muslim, but I went to the church, and I went to the volleyball team and the football team. I created my own community. In 1 year's time, in the Friesland drag team, people know me, And when I walk on the street, they call my name, and that connection, because they know me, they will always say, Baba is different. But the other ones,
but it's only because they know you and they know
me.
The others.
Yes, yeah. and that is my whole perception. That's why I think I should help more people to create that.
How many people get such a coaching trajectory in a year time?
Yeah, many. We work in Amsterdam. We work in Utrecht, Tilburg. I'll start a program in Tilburg next month.
Can you give an estimate? Are we talking dozens or hundreds of people?
Oh, for now we have on our more than 20,000 people we have trained.
Oh, okay.
In total,
wow.
More than 20,000 people all over.
Over a period of how many years?
9-10 years now.
And these people, so they're really helped to get out of
isolation. Get them out of isolation, so that because there are so many nice people in those centers, and they don't have the opportunity to bring themselves out. So we make it possible for them to go out of that isolation, get contact with Dutch people, and then before you know, even when that's one of the things why the IND and the Dutch government doesn't want that program, because it makes it difficult for them to go back.
Yeah, because they're too rooted and they get too many supporters as well for the cause.
Precisely.
But to go back to her question, in the sense that, okay, this is what refugees or migrants or people on the move can do if they get the right assistance. But what can we do, aside of becoming another coach and buddy in your project? As like people who are living here for a longer period of time, are rooted in society? Yes.
Well, maybe I can add something small to what he said. I believe there's a very big difference or I should call it a big gap that the citizens have created with migrants. You will not get to know our problems if you don't interact with us, if you don't integrate with us. Many people call us thieves, thugs, rapists, like he said, but you cannot get my ideas if you cannot come closer to me, or you don't give me a chance to express who I am, really. So I think to everybody here who has a chance, just a change of just one life can do an impact. But you cannot change anybody's life if you cannot interact or integrate with this person. So the change starts with you.
Yeah, I was thinking an applause, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely. Yeah, just to add like one small thing to that, I think there are already, there are literally 100 like physical places in Amsterdam where you could go, where people are organizing themselves, where like refugees, undocumented refugees are organizing themselves. Google will help you out. There's even
Facebook
an app called Welcome, and if you download it, it connects you to status holders, to like documented refugees, to meet them, to do like fun stuff with them. So there's so many options to meet people. I would just like to finish my my contribution with saying that I would rather not like talk about refugees as in they are going to contribute to our society or to our economy, because that really puts the responsibility at the refugees. Like they have some kind of responsibility to do something here. Well, I think we have to we have to turn it around and look at what the responsibility the Dutch state has, because there's something called human rights, and they have to respect human rights, but they also have to take responsibility for the fact that the Netherlands colonized places all over the world for 400 years, and that the Dutch companies are still like neo-colonizing countries all over the world. And not to forget, the Netherlands is one of the richest countries in the world. Amsterdam is the capital of this country. We have a responsibility to share our wealth with the rest of the world, because basically we're stealing it from the rest of the world. So
this is a very clear political statement.
Well,
one I expected of you, JC,
Yeah.
but I saw Baba's face going like.
It deserves an applause. It deserves an applause. But I will just say, you know, as human beings, we all have responsibilities. And if I walk to Utrecht gemeente, the municipality of Utrecht, and I see most of my brothers and sisters, they are sitting down there waiting for money at the end of the month, making their hands like this, I feel sympathy. Because those people, when I know, most of them, I knew them 20 years ago. But the system didn't help them to take steps and change their lives. So if all of us can help people with talent, you know,
Give
help
them a
them
fair chance at least.
Help them get a chance. Help them be humans and believe in themselves and to take steps. Of course, we cannot just put all the burden on Dutch government and Dutch people. So then we also need to take steps, and they take steps, and we meet each other in the middle.
All right. Now, Max is now really dancing, showing me that he really has to stop, I think. I like the fact of talking about frames. What we saw here was very interesting. Of course, from your position, JC, as a political spokesperson, you will point the Dutch government and the Amsterdam city on its responsibility. Whereas you, Baba, as a person who has also been part of the system, is pointing at yourself and showing your own responsibility. And this shows exactly how we all have different perspectives and how important it is to bring all these perspectives on the table. And having said that, we conclude this meeting. You can talk and we can continue our conversation downstairs with halal and minder halal drinks. Halal and less halal drinks. Sorry, I was half Dutch, half English, and half everything else. I want to thank again all the guests, Hadeya, JC, Baba, Dunya, and Ismail. I want to thank the program maker, Max, for making this program. I want to thank all the partners, so the Pakhuis de Zwijger, and the European Culture Fund, and Amsterdam City Right, and Crisis Mag. Go all visit online and have some serious reading. Conclusively, I want to say something. Max, can you go back to the picture? I want to make a personal statement on this picture. So what we see here is a picture from the UK in which you see all the names of people drawn recently in the Mediterranean. People that were on the move. And apparently someone thought it wise or prudent or acceptable to graffiti this on top of the names of the death that we should mourn and that we should appreciate, because they were people with dreams, with hopes, with aspirations, with lives, with stories to tell. They were not invaders nor refugees. They were humans. And that's why I wanted to moderate this program and host this, because for me this goes really straight into my heart. Then, next slide. Was a proper second of silence, thank you. Of course, Pakhuis has many other nice, interesting programs. One of which I want to point out is the one on frames in school books. It's in Dutch, but it's very interesting about what we actually teach our children and how and which stereotypes we have in Dutch school books as we speak. JC seems like a program you would really be interested in. Just saying, we're expecting you. And then conclusively, as a proper devout Christian, this is the time that we're going to collecteren. No, but I would like to point you out that all the programs here are free. So we have this perfect system, very democratic, pay as you like. I would like to say pay what you can afford. So if you can afford anything and you think these conversations are important, please do your dues. All right, drinks. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Meneer.